It was just before midnight on November 19 that Chancellor Angela Merkel's dream of a so-called Jamaica coalition collapsed. The political constellation consisting of the Conservative Union parties, CDU, CSU, the business-friendly Free Democrats, FDP, and the pro-environment Greens, whose colors together reflect those of the Caribbean country's flag, was to not be. Christian Lindner, the FDP leader, stood up from the negotiating table in the Parliamentary Association building and declared that his party had had enough. The FDP could not support policies they didn't believe in, he said. Outside, Lindner said a few words into the microphones, then vanished into the night. Disappointed and aghast, the Chancellor was left with the negotiators from her own Christian Democratic Union, CDU, its Bavarian sister party, the CSU, and the Greens. Merkel thought she had almost secured her fourth term in office, had believed the new Jamaica coalition was possible, and now this. Weeks of exploratory talks revealed political gulfs between the parties that even Merkel, the experienced strategist, couldn't bridge. Read more. Angela Merkel fails, yet still comes out on top. It is at least a day of deep contemplation about how things proceed in Germany. But I want to say to you that I, as Chancellor, will do everything to lead this country through these difficult weeks. It is better not to govern than to govern incorrectly. An agreement would have been possible with the necessary goodwill. We were ready for this agreement right till the last seconds, and, even to go a bit further, where you cannot actually go, the SPD is not the spare wheel on Ms. Merkel's careening car. It is a pity that we did not succeed in achieving that which was within our reach. This party political egoism damages our democracy. We believed we were on a path where an agreement could have been reached. I regret, with respect for the FDP, that we could not come to a mutual agreement. Merkel has failed. She wanted to pursue green and black politics and not engage with the concerns of the FDP. The collapse of talks was the logical consequence. You can do what the FDP did, but don't have to. Well-prepared spontaneity. The decent thing would have been if all party chairpeople had announced the cancellation together. I see that we're having an effect. Frau Merkel has failed, and it is time for her to go as Chancellor. Author, Ajit Niranjan. Germany is changing. So in 2017 Merkel failed to achieve what she had managed 3 times before, presenting a new cabinet a few weeks after the election and a sheaf of papers bearing the title, Coalition Agreement. The new distribution of power in the Bundestag had left her with much less room to maneuver after the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany, AfD, entered parliament for the first time, securing 12.6% of the vote. Read more. AfD, meet the new far-right bosses, same as the old bosses. The CDU, in turn, lost so much support that the only way it could form a dual alliance was with the Social Democrats, SPD. One reason for the CDU's disappointing election result was Merkel's controversial refugee policy, which had led to a rift with her Bavarian sister party, the CSU, and had polarized German society. Never before had the Chancellor been heckled on the campaign trail with shouts of "Get lost" and "Merkel must go." Now she had gambled on the Jamaica alliance, in vain. Once again, the prospect of forming a government was wide open. A man holds a sign reading, "Merkel must go," at a campaign rally. Merkel, home alone. Germans are seen as having staying power, in politics, too. Helmut Kohl, who died last year, was Chancellor for 16 years. Angela Merkel has been in office since 2005 and feels well qualified to follow in his footsteps. The problem is, she can't find partners to support her anymore. Her critics say that whoever governs with, or rather under, Angela Merkel gets marginalized, and is essentially governed into the ground. The last 3 federal elections clearly demonstrated this. In 2009, after the first grand coalition between the SPD and the CDU, CSU, the Social Democrats' share of the vote dropped dramatically. Then in 2013, after 4 years in government with Merkel, the FDP didn't even get the 5% of the vote required for representation in the Bundestag, and it took them a very long time to recover. Another grand coalition followed, which again did not pay off for the SPD. On the 24th of September 2017, the Social Democrats suffered the worst election result in their history. The once proud National Party plummeted in the polls, gaining just 20.5% of the vote. A brief window for change, yet 2017 started so promisingly for the SPD. At the end of January, Vice-Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel, whom few Social Democrats saw as a heavy-hitting challenger for Merkel, stepped down as leader of the SPD. He presented Martin Schulz, the long-term president of the European Parliament, as his successor and the SPD's chancellor candidate. The Social Democrats responded to the decision as if it were a long-awaited omen of liberation. They celebrated Schulz, the former bookseller from Würselen, as their savior and redeemer. The SPD gained thousands of new members. Schulz was elected party leader with a sensational 100% of the vote. The Social Democrats shot up in the opinion polls, and at times they were put ahead of the CDU. It seemed that the winds of change were blowing. Schulz gave the SPD a massive boost in the polls in early 2017, but the upswing didn't last. But the Schulz hype turned out to be just a flash in the pan. One after another, the SPD lost state elections in Saarland, Schleswig-Holstein, and in the party heartland of North Rhine-Westphalia, NRW. The political rule of thumb is that you can't win on a federal level if you lose in NRW. And it proved just so. Angela Merkel remained unfazed by the euphoria around Martin Schulz. She made up ground in the polls and by early summer was clearly ahead again. For his part, Schulz failed to capitalize on being a fresh face on the domestic political scene and not having been part of Merkel's coalition cabinet. He misdirected his energy during the campaign and didn't press the Chancellor hard enough on policy detail. Read more. German Social Democrat, we failed miserably as a party. On election night, when it became clear that the SPD had suffered heavy losses, Schulz took appropriate action. Addressing his supporters at party headquarters in the Willy Brandt House, he announced that the Grand Coalition had been voted out. His words were met with a storm of applause. I have therefore recommended to the SPD party leadership that the SPD should go into opposition, he said. In opposition, his party would fundamentally reposition itself and put clear blue water between itself and the CDU. It hadn't been possible to do this as part of a coalition government, he said. Steinmeier opposes fresh elections, but when the Jamaica idea bit the dust, Martin Schulz's phone rang. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier asked the SPD leader to visit him at his residence, Schloss Bellevue, along with the party leaders of the CDU and CSU. From that point on, the SPD could say goodbye to the prospect of regenerating in opposition. The head of state's message was clear. As the second-largest party in parliament, the SPD also shared some of the responsibility for ensuring that Germany got a stable government again. Failure to form a coalition and consequent new elections were not, he said, an acceptable solution. So, once again, all eyes are suddenly on the SPD, the party which Merkel described after the vote as not fit for government. There's no talk of that now, not since the power-conscious CDU leader started homing in on the Grand Coalition 3 project, dubbed ROCO 3. Merkel's party backed her when the Jamaica exploratory talks collapsed. The CDU also resolved its quarrels with the CSU. All that's missing is a coalition partner. Open-ended talks. Schulz was forced to make a move. Eventually, he announced that he was prepared to enter into constructive, but open-ended, exploratory talks with the CDU. At the SPD party conference, he was given a mandate to negotiate, but many Social Democrats urgently warned against entering into a grand coalition under Merkel's leadership for a third time. They fear the SPD would not be able to implement key elements of its program, such as greater state coordination of health insurance or allowing refugees' immediate family members to join them in Germany. In its unease about a repeat of the unpopular dual alliance, the SPD is now putting forward alternative models, such as a so-called cooperation coalition, which would only commit to certain common goals, leaving contentious points open. Merkel isn't keen on these proposals. A grand coalition would have a clear majority of 399 in the new Bundestag, which now comprises 709 representatives, making it the largest in history. If she can't bring about a coalition agreement, Merkel will be on shaky ground. It's far from given that the CDU would still close ranks behind her if another election were called. New talks in a new year. For now, the situation remains unresolved. Majority of voters don't like this. Business leaders are pressing for a solution, and allies in Europe are raising their eyebrows. French President Emmanuel Macron recently wished Angela Merkel "bon courage, good luck." His plans for reforming the EU can't progress without a new German government. Exploratory talks are set to begin on January 7th. Schulz has promised his party that he will include it at every step, so he wants to hold a congress to get the approval of party delegates before exploratory talks would progress into formal coalition talks. The bigger hurdle, however, would come after that. The SPD's 440,000 members will be allowed to vote on whether or not it should enter into another grand coalition. The general prognosis is that there is little chance of a new government being in place before Easter. So the extraordinary election year 2017 ends with the old Grand Coalition carrying on with business as usual, until the new Grand Coalition has, perhaps, been cobbled together. The first democratic government to rule West Germany since the end of World War II saw Christian Democratic Union leader Konrad Adenauer form a governing coalition with the Free Democrats and the German Party, a now defunct National Conservative Party. When Adenauer's Conservatives won re-election 4 years later, he once again turned to the same coalition partners. After 4 years of ruling West Germany on their own between 1957 and 1961, the Conservative Union lost their majority in the Bundestag and were forced to enter into coalition with the Free Democrats again. Adenauer resigned in 1963 for his part in the so-called Spiegel scandal. His Minister of Economic Affairs Ludwig Erhard was elected by Parliament to take over. The first ever Grand Coalition was not the product of an election. Ludwig Erhard was re-elected in 1965 and continued to rule alongside the FDP. However, the following year the Free Democrats left the government over budget disputes. Erhard also resigned and Kurt Kiesinger, right, was chosen to take over. With the FDP out, he governed with the Social Democrats, led by Willy Brandt, left. Willy Brandt became Germany's first social democratic chancellor in the post-war period. Despite winning fewer votes than the CDU/CSU, Brandt struck a deal with the FDP to give them a narrow majority in the Bundestag. It wouldn't be the last time the Liberals would be called out for a perceived lack of loyalty. In 1974, Brandt was replaced by Helmut Schmidt, who went on to win 2 more elections. The 13-year friendship between the SPD and FDP ended in 1980 as the two parties' differing ideologies became irreconcilable. The Liberals again switched sides that year, dropping out of the coalition and seeking a deal with the Conservatives. That caused the SPD-led government to collapse and a reborn CDU/CSU-FDP coalition formed under the leadership of Helmut Kohl. Pictured. Shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germany held its first ever elections. The Christian Democrats under Lothar de Maizière took over 40% of the vote. They went into coalition with 2 small parties, German Social Union and Democratic Awakening, whose members included one Angela Merkel. In October that year, the government signed the reunification treaty with West Germany. In 2002, Helmut Kohl's 16-year rule came to an end and the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schröder returned to power. The SPD formed a coalition with the Green Party, who became a governing party less than 20 years after being founded. Unlike under Brandt, the SPD now led a left-wing government, rather than a center-left coalition. The SPD-Green Party coalition remained in power until 2005. Grand coalitions do not come easily. When the first exit polls came in, both Schröder, right, and Angela Merkel, left, declared themselves the winner. In the end, Merkel's Conservatives defeated the SPD by just 1%. Germany's 2 largest parties agreed to form the country's second-ever Grand Coalition. The Grand Coalition experiment ended in 2009, after the SPD picked up a disappointing 23% in the federal elections. The Free Democrats, by contrast, gained almost 5% to give them over 14% of the vote. Merkel and the FDP's Guido Westerwelle left formed a coalition with relative ease. It was, after all, Germany's 11th CDU/CSU-FDP government. After taking more than 40% of the vote, Merkel's Conservatives probably weren't expecting to rule with the SPD. But with her old allies the FDP failing to meet the 5% threshold to enter the Bundestag, options were limited. Merkel called on the SPD to join her and take on the responsibility to build a stable government. She'd be making the same speech again 4 years later. Author, David Martin.